So welcome everyone to the first in our series of Evolutionary Leaders community calls on mobilizing for change. And we have invited John Clausen and Roger Collis, who have been long time deep participants in the Findhorn community, to speak today about the Findhorn community experiment, embracing the challenges of this evolutionary moment. So we're going to explore the process of evolutionary change today through the eyes of this beautiful community in northern Scotland that is a living laboratory for co-creating the new paradigm. So I'm really excited to hear some of the ways that the Findhorn community has been meeting these challenges of this moment. And many of them we're familiar with, and others are very particular to their community. But they're definitely in one of those incubation periods where great stress creates the opportunity for transformational change. So I'm going to ask John and Roger to introduce themselves, but first, I just want a general kind of hands up from you who are here today to see whether those of you who are participating live on this call have a relationship with Findhorn, whether you've been there, whether you've been involved with the community in some place or another. So if you just raise your hand if you're on screen and you've been to Findhorn or you have a relationship with Findhorn. Or if you're, the rest of you, I would assume are coming in new. Diane and I, for instance, first met members of the Findhorn community at the United Nations, where we were all representing different non-governmental organizations. And Findhorn was always a voice, particularly for the ecological movement, and as well as teaching us how to be in community. So John Clausen and Roger Collis, I'd like to invite you to tell us a little bit about your background. And oh, I wanted to say one other thing, which is that the Source of Synergy Foundation organized a synergy circle at Findhorn 3 years ago. It was called Co-Creating with the Intelligence of Nature. And we had just an extraordinary experience there. It was really, I don't know, for me, I think on some levels, it was quite life-changing. And I'm gonna share a group shot so you can see that many members of our Evolutionary Leaders community were there. And the others whom you may not recognize, some of them are friends of the Source of Synergy Foundation, and others are members of the Findhorn community, including some very prominent members. The son of one of the founders, or actually two of the founders, and others, including John, who helped us organize it. John did a fabulous job, and others who were instrumental in building the community and keeping the community vibrant and important on an international scale. So that's all I'm going to say, and I will pass the mic to John and to Roger.
Well, John and I tossed up who would go first, and it's me. So I will share briefly, about myself and sort of orientation to Findhorn and why I'm there. I first came in 1970, actually, as a youngster living in the United Kingdom. I was exploring different spiritual traditions and esoteric groups. And one thing that was happening in Britain at the time was this notion of a new consciousness seeking to break through. I don't know whether it was prevalent in other parts of the world, but certainly prevalent there in the United Kingdom. And Findhorn was part of this network of spirit centers in and around the UK. And so as a youngster, I began to research and engage, and going to Findhorn in 1970 sort of reinforced and substantiated this vision that there was actually something practical that could be experienced and demonstrated. And this new consciousness not be a theory, but something actually that could be put into action. And as a youngster, I was actually able to do things practically to, that community. It got me Iona, the Isle of Iona on the west coast of Scotland, and the spiritual presence that Iona has as sort of the mother house for Celtic Christianity. And so I've maintained this relationship with the place for over 50 years. And over the last 12 or so years, being a trustee and intimately involved in many of the challenges, spiritual and economic and identity that the place is facing, as many spiritual centers are facing. And I think that there's a sort of a commitment that I have to the place, wanting to ensure its thriving and its future, and discuss a spirituality that is also not just place-based geographically in northern Scotland, but a spirituality that is planetary, because part of Findhorn's service was not simply to a group of people in Scotland, but to be of service to the planet as a whole. And just on a personal note, I've done many things forming the Lorien Association, where we began to explore the notion of community, not simply as place, but community as a state of being inside oneself, where one provides community wherever one might be in the workplace or in family life. And that led me into a whole experimentation around my own personal process of how to apply these spiritual principles, which led me into working with the US Department of Energy on nuclear remediation, and working with China on improving bilateral relations between the US, China, and other things. So for me, it's the practical and the visionary coming together and being integrated and embodied, and that's what Findhorn represents to me, and this wonderful opportunity to use it as an illustration of what we're all dealing with as evolutionary leaders. So it's a joy to be here and to share the Findhorn experiment, because of late it's become very introverted and somewhat closed in. And I think by sharing the spirit of the place with the ELs and with other groups, it brings confidence to the place, particularly given the fires that happened there that have been quite challenging, and the COVID lockdown. So thanks for the opportunity to be with you all and to share. So John, what is your story? John and I, we met in the 1970s, didn't we, John, first?
Yes, I was coming, you were going.
Okay.
You were going off with the Lorians and I was coming, right, landing. So there's so much to share and to discuss, and we're gonna approach it from a few angles relatively briefly, and then take it wherever you guys want to go, whether it's toward what you're up to or whether it's more deeply into the weeds of what's actually happening internally at Findhorn. But I'm going to try and tell my origin story in just 2 minutes or so, how I got there, and then maybe what my connection is now. So I was a college student in the 1960s in Boston, in the middle of the counterculture and the Vietnam draft, that environment. In 1969, I went to Paris to finish my degree. I was deeply seeking meaning in life, in truth, like so many of us. And I learned TM, and TM was a key to me to discover my infinite nature, and basically was the key to changing my world and my worldview. And I was very keen to teach it, share that, allow other people to have that kind of opening. So I left college, went off with Maharishi for a couple of years, trained to be a TM teacher, did very, very long extended meditations, and then helped train new teachers. The high point of that was helping create Maharishi International University, the first consciousness-based institution of higher learning that I was aware of, and working with professors to generate the core curriculum so that we could get accredited. That was really sort of an idyllic, contemplative life in this beautiful, it was in an Italian village in the mountains in the hills outside of Rome. So in '73, I'd started an organic farm because I was very deeply, had a very deep resonance with the value of healthy soil for health, because it helped me become healthy when I had health challenges. I started a farm business. I was teaching TM, and I was finishing my degree by writing a thesis called On the Mechanics of Spiritual Development, which was fascinating research. I read Paul Hawkins' article, The Magic of Findhorn, which was intriguing and a bit off-putting because he used such hyperbole to portray a community where people cavorted with nature spirits and pagan gods like Pan, and the founders received guidance and then put it into manifestation by following these laws of manifestation, and they lived in perfect harmony, and it was just too good to be true. And I had a pretty well developed inner life, and I hadn't experienced all these beings and pagan gods and things, so I was wary. Then a year later, I was invited to a talk with David Spangler, William Irwin Thompson, and Cheryl Weinberg from Lindisfarne, Findhorn, and Oroville. And of course, I was attracted to William Irwin Thompson because his sort of intellectual approach was kind of resonated with me, and I loved his work. I was familiar with his work. And so I wanted to go and connect with Lindisfarne, which I did. I was very closely connected for 21 years. But David somehow, with his depth and his sort of groundedness, demystified Findhorn. He obviously had a depth to him, but he said things like, people often go to Findhorn to escape what they don't like about life or they don't like about themselves. And what they end up discovering is just what they tried to run away from. So he demystified it. The next day I got the call that this was the right step for me to take. So I get to Findhorn and had a series of, magical experiences that I don't need to detail here. I'll mention one or two quick anecdotes. It was clear to me that I belonged there. I had this skill to teach TM. There were clearly people there who needed it, young people who would be part of the group meditations every day, and they weren't settling down into the depths of the quietness and silence. So I felt, well, they could use something to bring them into that deep silence so they could participate more meaningfully in the group inner work. So, and I felt the community life was my next personal step. So I went to Peter Caddy, the founder, and said I wanted to live there and buy a house. And I said I thought I could teach, I had something to offer people through this TM. And he said, no way. We don't want teachings, we don't want gurus, we don't want techniques. People who come here are beyond that. So we don't have a place for that. So I continued to look for a house, but not sure whether it would be appropriate for me to ever move there. And then a week later, he comes up to me and he says, these two psychics, Wayne and Bella, whom he had a kind of high respect for, and he tended to have a bit of a weakness for psychics. And he said, they're coming, and I've made the first appointment for you to have a reading with them. So I went and had a reading with them, and they said just what I had intuited. You belong here. There's people who need TM, and you're going to teach TM, and you're going to work with some of the Caddy family. And also that it's the next step for you personally, and that you shouldn't have a house in the park. You should have a house on the outskirts of the park, which was the park's main campus, because you need a little more personal space for your particular style, and you're going to have a TM center. So I said, great, that's just what I believed. So he told Peter, and then Peter accepted me. I bought a house. So that's sort of the beginning of how I got there. Now, 47 years later, I still have the house, and I have another place as well in the park. And I'm connected through a variety of roles. I'm a Findhorn Fellow. I'm a resource person. Frances and I, my wife, represent Findhorn at the United Nations in New York. We've also been fiscal sponsors for the foundation and about 8 other organizations. My wife and I run a US public charity, and we've done a lot of fiscal sponsorships. So we work with about 8 organizations at Findhorn to channel funds from US donors. And I'm an investor in multiple projects there, supporting the development of the Eco-Village. And basically, I'm just someone who loves the community, what it represents, what it is, and what it aspires to. And I think what's most compelling for me is it's a spiritually based, holistic approach to finding solutions and demonstrating them and educating about them. So it's a holistic attempt to live the solutions rather than focus on the problems. Now, there are plenty of issues that are problematic that we're going to be addressing today, but it's trying to demonstrate answers. And I feel that that's where I have energy for that. My next door neighbor was Fred Krupp, who runs the Environmental Defense Fund, and we used to take walks together and compare what gives us energy. This example of a community trying to live holistic values on the ground gives me energy. For him, it's working with scientists to influence governors and politicians and big companies to do incremental changes in policy. And he gets off on that. It's a kind of whatever gives us the juice we need to serve. So that's me. And we'd like to, before moving into the meditation that Roger is going to lead, just find out from each of you what you would like to get out of this call, and particularly what your connection with Findhorn is. So there's time to speak because there's not many of us. How about Linnea, since I remember.
I was trying to remember when I was first at Findhorn, which was 1978.
Wow.
And I did the whole Findhorn experience. Been there several other times. Once over a New Year's conference with, I can't remember his name now. Did you mean Bella Karish?
I think so. I don't remember her last name. Wayne and Bella.
It's Bella Karish.
From Los Angeles.
Yeah.
She was one of my first psychic readers. I didn't know she'd done Findhorn. It's wonderful. And I was there for the News Story Conference. I think several of you were there for the News Story Conference in, was that 2016?
14, I think.
14? Really? Oh my God. How time flies. I guess I would most likely, I'd love to know how the community is surviving. It's been one of the light centers in the world since its founding. And I'm very connected with the Whidbey Institute here and Hollyhock. And I know all of the centers are having a hard time because everything is changing. Also, how I got into evolutionary work was through David Spangler in San Francisco in a little bit later than 78, but not much, at the Institute for the Study of Conscious Evolution. And I live on Whidbey and got here in large part through David. So it's all these wonderful weavings are
great. That's terrific. Thank you.
Well, I can go next. I visited Findhorn twice, once for the Synergy Circle that Deborah just mentioned on co-creating with the intelligence of nature. And then I was also there in 2018 for the conference Co-Creative Spirituality, Shaping Our Future with the Unseen World. I just totally loved it there. I love the sense of solidarity and community that one feels whenever they go there. And I'm just fascinated with working with the unseen world. So Findhorn is definitely a place for that. And I would love to hear more. I know Roger mentioned when he was younger, he was interested in putting new consciousness into practice. So I just love to learn about any lessons learned, lessons that you felt like you learned about that. And also, John, any other best practices?
Margot, do you have a connection with Findhorn? I remember we used to have long discussions about threshold organizational development and comparing notes about my experience at Findhorn back in the 80s.
Well, I'm continuously there in my heart and have been for decades. And it's just such an incredible model for the world. And most recently, along with Kurt, I've been on all of the Humanity Rising calls, the summit during the COP26 summit. And, you know, Marilyn Hamilton keeps popping up, and there's just all sorts of conversation about integral city meshworks and transition towns and all the organizations that are linking up. So I'm particularly just interested on both the inner and the outer planes in this time of Code Red for Humanity, where we're both doing, I mean, our community in Boulder that moved here 36 years ago, and a lot of whom originated in Threshold, and you know many of them, has put together a little regenerative community in action. And we're doing a lot of work on the ground here on both the inner and outer planes, and just pointers that you all would have at that level. Just, you know, as Diane was saying, the tools, just the modeling, that's of great interest.
Good, thank you. Anybody else? John, Kurt, Tayana, Kristen?
I'm happy to jump in. When Donuts and Thresholds started in 1981, there were those of you who had been at Findhorn and Oroville, and I'm blanking on the community at the time, which I think is still going in Arizona.
Arcasante.
And of course, there was Lindisfarne. And I think, though, that the energy from those communities had a profound impact on what became Donuts and Threshold. And it's still alive. So I'm actually getting the chills as I say that, which surprises me. Even though I haven't been part of Donuts and Threshold, nor has Margot in the last number of years, but I think that energy is still alive. I think what animates in a certain way the evolutionary impulse that led to evolutionary leaders and a number of other things. And John, in many ways, my main reason for being on the call was you, given our relationship in those early years and how much I respected you and how much you brought to the table and still do. And so I just feel an aliveness in what you've shared and what you're sharing. And I have nothing other than wanting to keep hearing what's going on and kind of getting an update. And then, you know, so many people we've known have been to Findhorn over the years. It just hasn't been our place to go, but we feel, you know, maybe like part of the fifth circle or something like that.
Thank you so much. That's how I feel about Hollyhock.
Yeah.
Same thing.
Yeah, it's interesting that, you know, my interest and my passion here too is the way you're connecting the past with the future. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt that the future, and particularly the future of the ELs, is in this emerging era of groups and groups and networks of networks, and whether that infrastructure globally can actually make a change relative to power and polity and the old paradigm of how it's done in the world and not succeeding, and how it might succeed in the future. And I had just before this done a interview with David Sloan Wilson for Voice America on the direction of conscious evolution and successful groups. And they're doing a big program with Plum Village in France in April, Thich Nhat Hanh's community, a really ambitious plan that they're doing pro-social world there, which is interesting in the sense of eco villages and communities and those role models in the future. And then the other synchronicity is we're doing a book with Paul Mills, Deepak's director of research. And I just got done reading his introduction because we were talking, asking the question, how much can he say personally about his own really deep spiritual experiences, particularly ones that are really out there, because he's a scientist with 400 juried publications and a psychiatrist and everything else. But point being is that I would say half of his introduction is about Maharishi University and his roots of the years that he was also there in Iowa. You may well have known him during that period when he was also there. So when I hear all these cross discussions, I just see all these tendrils that I see moving from the past into the future. And I think that if there's any really positive hope for where our future can go, it's going to be in this discovery of community at all of these levels, and particularly related to how that can work within technology and maybe get us to a global culture that will work instead of the type that we have now.
Good points. Thank you, Kurt. All right, one more maybe. Anyone else?
Yeah, I'd just like to throw in that I've had pretty much a lifelong intrigue and draw to Scotland. And I've known about Findhorn and Lindisfarne since the early 70s and sort of followed them a little bit from a distance until 2015 on a personal trip to Scotland. I was able to visit Findhorn and stayed in the area for about 3 days and just had a delightful, wonderful tour of the campus and met many of the people there, including the directors of the Findhorn Press at the time. I can't remember who their names right now, but it was just such a beautiful setting and such a warm welcome and feeling that, I just really enjoyed my brief time there. And I, as Linnea, am curious about how they're managing through all this, this time that we're all in too, and what vision of the Findhorn future is at this current time.
All right, welcome, Barbara.
Hi, John. Thank you. Good to be here with you.
We just introduced the meeting, and then Roger and I introduced ourselves, and folks have been sharing a little bit about what their connection with Findhorn is. If you'd like to share, please go ahead, and then we're going to move on to a meditation.
Oh, thank you, John. I have just really great fond memories of when we were all there a number of years ago. It was just a spectacular week, really inspiring on every level. So I'm really just excited about being on this call with all of you.
All right. Well, welcome everybody. And Roger, take it away. I think we can all mute ourselves.
Yes. So when John and I were talking, we were thinking about doing a sort of a Findhorn meditation, a way to bring in the energy that Findhorn represented. But I did want to present some context first before doing that. And one context is, Peter and Eileen Caddy and Dorothy McLean spent 10 years before going to the Findhorn Caravan Park in 1962, going through their own personal process of listening and working out, their dynamics as a group and their inner focus. So there was a lot of preparatory work in place before Findhorn actually started to emerge. So the seeds were planted inwardly in imagination and in consciousness. And the founders actually didn't really know what was going to portend. It was very much the unknown, very much at the cusp, or maybe at the forefront of an evolutionary imperative. But that imperative did not arise just at the human level, it arose at a deeper level within the soul of the world that in a sense is looking and still looking for places whereby this energy can be anchored and experienced amongst ourselves. So Findhorn came into being as an experiment, a laboratory to land this new energy. And it's so, at its heart, there is a planetary angelic presence that people who associate with Findhorn, who live there or extended members, fondly call the angel of Findhorn. And the angelic presences exist within all organizations and families and the workplaces and in sort of spiritual traditions and impulses historically and currently and into the future. But the energy of the angel of Findhorn was very much one of seeding the new and bringing in form a new consciousness and the opportunity for humanity or those that were attracted to it to touch into that. And as we were talking earlier about Lindisfarne and the work of Bill Thompson, when Bill came to Findhorn in 1972, that's what he experienced. He described it as a new etheric center and different to some of the other spiritual centers and traditions that were there in prior time. And it was his way to articulate this planetization, this new consciousness of a global nature that Kurt earlier was referring to. And so the challenge is really how to maintain and cultivate this relationship to this consciousness, and it to be also a place of demonstration, of practical action. And how does one hold the tension of the old seeking to, disappear, slough itself, and allow the new roots, green shoots, to come into to being. And that tension, I think, is perhaps what we are experiencing amongst ourselves. And certainly Findhorn is experiencing that in a very real way. And later on, we can have discussions, and perhaps John and I and all of us together can explore what that is. But in the meditation, I just wanted to not so much have a meditation, but guide a process along a sort of Findhorn lines, and I use that term very broadly. So if we could just be silent and just close our eyes, and this will be not a long meditation, but it's an illustration of what I think is part of Findhorn's values. And one is just the acknowledgement of so where we are. Is just to be present and know that
you're in San Diego. Oh, sorry.
So the place is so important, and the acknowledgement of where one is physically situated, and the intelligences that are there, and the intelligence of body. So there's always a blessing, and so we bless where we are. And we bless the unique gifts that each of us bring, the willingness to listen and to collaborate. So we bless ourselves and one another. And we bless the world around us, the sacredness, the life of this planet as it gives to us and we give to it. And we dedicate our time together and we welcome in the angel of Findhorn to join with us in our deliberations, to add its support, empowerment, upliftment, and may we in co-creation with this angelic presence strengthen the network of light and the evolutionary impulse that we are so intimately connected with. Thank you. So that's an example of sorts of a meditation of blessing and of giving to one another, and with the recognition that Findhorn has two faces to it. One is the face that we're going to see now, which is the physical demonstration, a short video that John is going to introduce. And the other face is the inner ecology that's non-physical. And part of the challenge that one faces is bringing these two together, the physical and the non-physical, in a way that brings wholeness into life. And the recognition that community also includes the non-physical beings who are wanting to join with us, and the challenge of how to do that.
All right.
And I say this as a frame for what John is going to introduce. So John, you're on for introduction there.
Yeah, thank you, Roger. This is just a 2 or 3 minute video. It's a very short video about the Eco Village, just to give you a sense of place, to bring it present. And it was prepared for our exhibition at COP26 as part of Findhorn's part of this network called the Scottish Communities Climate Action Network. And we showed this clip continuously during COP26. The clip is a series of images showing parts of the main campus of the Eco Village and noting a few of the activities there. It's not comprehensive. It's also silent, so don't worry if you don't hear any sound. Deborah. That's the nature sanctuary.
This has to be the most beautiful sewage processing plant in the world.
I was just going to say that. It smells good.
Yeah.
Or not bad, let's put it that way. That's where Deborah stayed. And Diane.
Love that shop.
So you're getting a sense of how it evolved into an eco-village as more and more folks who came to the community were inspired to create businesses and charities.
Beautiful.
Okay, so there you get a little idea of what it looks like. We didn't show where the community center and the sanctuary used to be, which burnt down last spring. So I'll just make a few comments, then turn it back to Roger. I think it's important to remember that Findhorn started as a spiritual community and that the eco-village came later as a sort of an evolving incarnation of our spiritual values. Also, one thing that the video didn't mention or go into was the central role of education for the Findhorn Foundation. Our mission at the Findhorn Foundation is transformational learning. And that's been the basis of both what we can offer to the world and the basis of our financial viability. So now with COVID and without some of our central buildings, we've had to cancel all our in-person educational program. And as a result, 85 to 90% of our income is no longer there. So what's next? How do we find a new way to serve that includes education, but isn't totally dependent on it? And yeah, how do we support ourselves? Roger, you can start from there.
Sounds a bit like a fundraising pitch, John.
No, fundraising. No.
I'm asking everyone for money. No. Seriously, there are serious issues facing many spiritual centers around financial sustainability. I don't need to tell you that. One of the aspects that is somewhat unique to Findhorn is the not having a spiritual leader, one charismatic individual or guru or spiritual tradition. So it's very much an experiment in group consciousness and in group leadership. And there's been lots of learning and some pain along this. But it is the relation between individual initiative and and creative thinking versus a process where everyone included in decision making. that's somewhat reflective in governance as well. You know, how does one have transparency in decision making? And the foundation has evolved into less of an informal structure and more into formality of being an employer. How do you maintain community, love, and care for one another, employee relationship? So that's something that's you know, we're struggling with. And as John said, you know, with all of the residential income not being possible because of the lockdown and the recent fires of losing the sanctuary and community center, you know, how do we transition to online learning and build a virtual community? You know, because so many people physically came to Findhorn for that sense of intimacy and being in relationship with other people on the place and the energy of the place. But if with climate change and, you know, people not wanting to travel as much, or there being in the near future some economic uncertainties or further breakdowns of systems, then how do you build a virtual community and carry the same power and presence that, you know, we were talking about, particularly in this sort of the idea of a spiritual presence, and how do you do that, that virtually? That's a massive issue. And then another is, for a lot of this evolutionary work, this aspiration that people have, a desire to do it, but in many cases there isn't the practical experience to do it, to actually effect change. And within an educational institution, which Findhorn Foundation is emerging into, you know, you need to have people who are capable and who can do the work, who are skilled in whether you're dealing with technology or in, you know, finances or in educational delivery, facilitation. You know, all of these factors require skill building. So how does one create an environment that supports professional development on the one side and attracts people who are able to perform in their role and be able also to support them? So, you know, the demographic at Findhorn, within the foundation, I should say, doesn't have a lot of younger people. So how do you reach out to a new generation and adapt the educational offering and the experience to a new generation? I mean, that's a massive issue that the foundation is facing, and with people who are very different to most of the residents who have lived there over the years. So that's a big issue.
So let me jump in here. So what you were saying, there are some vibrant, young, dynamic sections within the community with families, and they're really keen to have more affordable housing, and that's all being addressed. But one of the things I want to elucidate that you referred to about bringing in more professionalism and more good business practices into the foundation. For some people, that is like moving to another level of functioning where you bring in the best of the previous levels. Say you're using a spiral dynamics framework, you're bringing in some of the positive orange to this green environment, whereas to others, it's going backwards into the old story and they're having a problem with it. So those are some of the dynamics, you know, the degree to which the green meme and spiral dynamics is alive collectively inhibits some of the integration that needs to happen for the community to successfully take its next step. And like Deborah said at the beginning, it's an incubator. And if you look at it from the long view, if you take the distant view out, it's like it's an elegant evolutionary process of the high pressure and stress of these sort of colliding forces. how do you bring in more people to be educated at Findhorn and get the magic of Findhorn? And how do you reduce your carbon footprint to meet our goal of carbon neutral by 2030? So what's the formula that we're going to create? From the outside, the pressures are all there and it's cooking. From the inside, it's pretty chaotic. And there's a lot of excitement, but there's also difficulty, a lot of difficult dynamics on a bunch of different levels. So that's sort of where we stand. And one thing that I know some of you have backgrounds in integral and spiral dynamics, but there's been, I think, 3 cycles of bringing that sort of awareness into the community. First in the 1990s, I think Don Beck might have come, and spiral dynamics sort of became faddish, and that's where I first heard about it. And I actually, when I learned about it, it's part of what helped me re-energize my commitment to Findhorn, because I was kind of a little bit exhausted by the degree of processing without decisive decisions coming out of it. And then when I realized in spiral dynamics, there's another level. So this is just a stage. Well, that stage is not over, but it's being challenged to a point where it's not going to be able to last much longer. So there was that first flirtation. And then in the 2000s, Ian MacDonald, who was a student of David Sloan Wilson, he came to do his doctoral research on sort of integral dynamics in a spiritual community. And somebody recently sent me his report to the trustees from 2005, where he was again talking about this green meme. And a lot of us were describing it, and there was a lot of interest in second tier, but it was more conceptual interest. It wasn't where people's center of gravity was. So that sort of faded out. Then another round in 2014-16, a group got together and they brought in Ken Wilber and Doshin Roshi and a bunch of their students to kind of provide insights into where the community was stuck, the shadow of green, for example. And that built a lot of energy, but also generated a lot of resistance. So it kind of faded out. Now it's happening again, although the stuckness isn't there. That was there. It's more like now the situation is there's a recognition that they need to change. And it's just we haven't got the answers as to exactly how what that's going to look like in the next year. One thing they've done, which is both successful and controversial, is they've started the foundation has created a fundraising department that fundraises more like a traditional charity and does it with, quite a lot of, I won't say aggressive, but proactive. So they have brought in enough money to survive to this point. And even that's considered a bit controversial in some quarters. So what's going to be the next formula for a successful business plan that doesn't rely just on education? And they're looking at creating a trading arm. So there's a lot in the works. And Roger, do you want to take it from there?
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot in the works, and it's part of the challenge. And it's a very difficult conversation that we're having, because in a way, if one looks at the foundation as a laboratory, then one can sort of pull it apart and look at what's working and what isn't working. And yet, if one looks at it through the lens of appreciative inquiry, one looks at it from what are the strengths and what has it achieved over these years, and what is the vision for going forward. John, I actually would be perhaps interested in dialoguing with the group around some of their questions and observations, because I think we've shared a lot both around the potential and the challenges, and I think that's enough that we have gone into. So I'd like to hear from others, because this is really a highly energized and creative and accomplished group of individuals.
Is that Margot? No.
Well, I'll start with a question. Can you tell us a little bit more about the decision-making process at Findhorn? Who's in charge, and you know, kind of what the mechanics are? I think that would be very useful for us to know about, even in terms of the evolutionary leaders.
Well, John, shall I go, or were you going to jump in there?
I'll jump in with a little overview, and then you can jump in with maybe more specifics.
Yeah.
Ever since Peter Caddy, who was a very strong, charismatic leader, became clear that his role was to retire from that role and let the community govern itself, it's been challenging to make decisive decisions. And there have been a bunch of groups going back to the 90s. There were working groups, think tanks. There was a group called the Inquiry Circle. There was another group, which I funded for 4 years, called the Governance Systems Circle, which was exploring sociocracy, which was taken up quite successfully in certain smaller groupings within the eco-village, but not in the foundation. And we had consultants come in and teach and share different ways of making effective decision-making. The goal was to have Findhorn conceives of itself as using attunement as a primary way of making decisions, which doesn't always work out. It's too easy to block progress. So that's been one of my special interests in how the decision-making and governance structure evolves. So now there's this opportunity, which, and I'll finish with this point. Now that the sanctuary's gone, community center's gone. In the past, the Findhorn Foundation ran those two facilities for the benefit of the community. Well, now the interest is that the whole community will run it, not just the foundation, which is a large aspect. And how is the decision going to be made to rebuild them? Who's going to approve the designs? Who's going to pay for it? So there's a very strong process going on right now, run by John Talbot, who was my wife's first husband, who was sort of the architect of the eco-village. And he's come back from Australia, where he helped create a large eco-village. And he's facilitating a committee called DevCom, which has stakeholders from the major organizations, or representatives from the major stakeholders in the community, all working together to figure out a recommendation for how best to rebuild these two entities, and how to pay for it, and how to support their ongoing maintenance. So this has proved a very unifying, positive force in the community, having this skillfully facilitated group by someone who's also very tuned into the foundation and a skilled engineer. But the question that people are asking is, once they come up with their recommendations, who's going to decide whether to accept them, and how to accept them, and who's going to decide who's going to decide? I mean, they're asking these kind of questions, which is almost like going back to the drawing boards. It's not that progress isn't being made, it's that they're stepping back, and you can maybe address how the foundation's working on it, Roger.
Yeah, I mean, but to be clear, you know, the community itself, you know, which in this conversation we're calling the Findhorn Eco Village community, is one aspect of an overall community. There are people who live in the Findhorn village. There are people in the town of Collis. There are others who live in rural areas in the county of Moray. And then there's the Cluny Hill, was a large which was purchased in 1995, that became a campus for much of the educational activities. So the community itself is enormously diverse. And there are many organizations that have evolved within that community who, you know, have their own boards of directors, their own initiatives, and there isn't necessarily coordination amongst it all. And that's probably a good thing. And perhaps one could look at Findhorn, perhaps less community now and more as an emerging village. So what are the issues that villages have and neighborhoods and the scale there? The foundation has through a redundancy, the education charity, which did all of the educational programs and holds the deed for much of the assets. The redundancy went from approximately 120 people down to approximately 50. Well, that's an enormous reduction of staff. So imagine the pain that's associated with that. People who have lived there for a long time, suddenly losing not just livelihood, but feeling a sense of loss to the spirit of the place, and feeling that they have no ability to contribute, any longer. And so that's that trauma. And in addition to that, the fires that John was mentioning has caused a tremendous amount of anxiety and perhaps a loss of faith in the future. And so part of the decision making in answer to the question is wanting an organization where everyone is able to contribute and be responsible and have authority devolved into individual units. That's been the goal for many decades now. But then the need to have structures for decision-making and accountability. So what is the balance between accountability on the one hand and being able to make decisive decisions, particularly in a time of enormous transition and uncertainty in people's lives, and the need for security and accountability on the one hand, and on the other, devolving into an organizational structure, people feel self-empowered and responsible for their lives and their actions. So
well, thank you.
It has the trustees and has a management system in order to facilitate that process. And sometimes it works well. In many cases, it's terribly unwieldy.
But one thing that's still present is there's a very strong community spirit, because I get this from the people who are there. And that's why people want to live there. And more people keep wanting to come there. There's a lot of joy in the community and creative expression in the community. Some people see that and they don't concern themselves with the underlying structures that enable that to continue. But we're talking about what's underneath that's going to enable the continuance of that magic that's there and people experience there. And there was another point, but I can't remember what it was.
Well, thank you, because this rich response, I think we can all see how this is reflected in our larger world. And without that sense of community allegiance and that feeling of being in someplace special that has a special magic and a special purpose, that part is missing from many of our national governments, while we're experiencing the same kind of level of trauma in people's lives without our current democracies being able to effectively address them. So, that makes Findhorn a very important model. I see that Kanu has posted an interesting question in the chat, and I'm wondering whether she would like to ask it.
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciated the way, John, that you described the different ways that you've used the spiral over many years and how it's informed the move forward. And I've just been recently on doing my own little research into a lot of communities in the area, wanting to live in community and not exactly finding the right community for me, because many of them are talk about spirituality, but Findhorn does it in a way that is so welcoming to whatever path you're on. And I don't, and with all the challenges that you're describing in Findhorn, I'm just wondering which of the kinds of actions are actually moving you forward. Which actions, what actually seems, you just described the spirit of the community that's held on really strong. And that's so important. What's nurturing that, and what could nurture that even more to make this evolutionary leap forward? Is that clear?
Oh, no,
with all that?
It's a great question. And we could look at it from the outside, or we could look at it from the inside. One of the keynotes of Findhorn that Roger referred to, and that's core to Findhorn, is working with the whole ecology of life. That means the seen and the unseen, that it's not our job alone as humans to solve all these problems, that we have allies, and to be aware of those and be in a co-creative, constructive relationship with those. So that's a missing element in many worlds that are trying to address the problems that the world is facing. On the other hand, Findhorn doesn't have the answers yet. I would say the pressures are even more concentrated in this microcosm of Findhorn than they might be in some other places. And the community in general, I would say, is a more consciously trying to deal with them than in other places. And so those are the conditions that have the potential for some kind of constructive breakthrough. But we don't know if the community will come out on the other side being more relevant and strong, contributing, or less when this pressure cooker gets cooked. I mean, it's not as fast as that, but there is this pressure. And I love David Sloan Wilson's term, cultural catalysis. What's the cultural catalyst that might shift something? I had a long talk yesterday with Yvonne, whom a number of you know. And that's kind of what she was saying. She was saying, all these forces going on, there's a lot of positive, constructive things, but for it to fully work in this current climate, things have to change quite dramatically. And we're not quite there yet. Do you agree with that, Roger?
Yeah, I mean, I would say kind of that a lot of people are being attracted to Findhorn now and are kind of live there. So in a sense, the spirit is alive, it is magnetic. And if you call the angel of Findhorn, or whatever that presence is drawing to itself what it needs for its next, evolutionary step. So the people who come may be coming with something to contribute, as opposing to get something. And the challenge with the composition of the community is that people came for all sorts of reasons. And because of that, you have a lot of disparity in terms of energy and conflicting images and visions as to what it's to be. But if you're cool to be at a place like Findhorn, then just come and manage your expectations and jump in, because it's a wonderful place to be associated with in whatever way you choose.
What a wonderful invitation. So I'd like to ask whether anyone else has any questions or comments that they'd like to add before we only have 15 minutes left, and I'd like us to have a little bit of time to move into the discussion of partnership and alignment and how that can work in the future. So, but I don't want to inhibit any further questions or comments from any of you who are listening to this fascinating.
And whether this has triggered anything that you'd like to share about your own organizations and the way that you all are responding to these pressures and these conditions.
Well, if not, maybe some of your ideas will come forward in this topic that we're going to address next, which is the whole idea of partnership among organizations. So first of all, I want to say that we certainly could be more conscious of the angel of synergy that's guiding our work. And I think all of you who are on this call are noticing that the Evolutionary Leaders Circle is moving into a new level of development, not only with the large number of new members that we will be welcoming in next month, but also our vision for creating an evolutionary partnership circle. And possibly a partnership summit to launch that circle, to explore with organizations like Findhorn and some of the organizations that you represent and that are represented in our Evolutionary Leaders Circle already, what it means to work in partnership. We certainly developed a very strong and beautiful partnership, thanks to John, when we co-created our Synergy Circle at Findhorn in 2018. And now that we look at having a partnership circle and really asking who are the organizations who are in deep alignment of purpose with the evolutionary leaders, what would that look like? How can we work more deeply together? How can we learn more from one another in the way that we're learning on this call? And how can we benefit from each other's wisdom and co-create a greater impact moving forward? We're all aware that we're in a very critical moment here on planet Earth, and that all of our efforts are important in forging a new way to live in harmony with the planet. Findhorn has certainly been a pioneer in that respect. So I'd like to open the floor first to John and Roger, and then to all of you about how you see us working in deeper partnership with other organizations, so that the reality that Paul Hawken envisioned in Blessed Unrest, when he said that there were all of these organizations were happening invisibly across the planet, of people who want to make a better world for the future. Your thoughts?
John, do you want to jump in, then I'll go?
Well, I'll jump in briefly to say that just the acknowledgement that Kurt made of the ways that several different organizations are interlinked on this call. The Donuts Threshold, certainly Hollyhock and Findhorn and others. And also just to acknowledge that the connections that are already there between Findhorn and the ELs. There's at least 5 or 6 ELs that are Findhorn fellows. A number of ELs have taught at Findhorn, visited at Findhorn, consulted for Findhorn. So there's already a sort of a web of connections. It's what we want to do consciously to take that to another step.
Yeah, I just add to include here the Whitby Institute and what Linnea from Whitby Island was sharing, because in the 1980s it was then Nook Learning Community, Lorien Association, this Fun Association, and Finland came together to explore sort of joint educational programming and how we could sort of work together. That didn't come to much, but the linkages were important, and the energy that was experienced between us. And so that was an example of an early exploration of partnership. And I just think the way for the future is collaboration, you know, and opening up and sharing expertise amongst each other and energy and resource. And I know that through Findhorn, again, there is the Holistic Centers Network that was developed with many other intentional communities and mainly place-based organizations. But that was is an example of an evolutionary thrust of sorts. So I'm very much in favor of the ELs. And in fact, John and I have discussed ways in which perhaps following this call, there could be some follow-up with you, Deborah and Diane, around, you know, connecting with Findhorn to further its education and what you are doing.
Beautiful. Well, I was just about to invite Kurt Johnson to weigh in, and I see he has his hand up. So, Kurt.
Yeah, I've been taking a lot of notes because this is so multidimensional, and it's really, you know, involves all the questions of the moment. And I'm actually going to try to speak to some of them on the 7th. You know, the problem our species has is we don't do well with multiple points of volition and multiple points of agency. With many chefs in the kitchen, we don't do well. And that's even sparked this global debate about what works best, dictatorship or democracy. And even among sociologists that David Sloan Wilson is talking to, this discussion of tight structures and loose structures of governance, and how we could become ambidextrous in having cultures that can be tight when they need to be tight and loose when they need to be loose. And so, you know, one of the problems that we have with situations like existing communities, which become so complex, like John was talking about, if you're actually operating as a subculture within a culture like Findhorn, it's very difficult then for a subculture to remain you know, sustainable when the culture itself is completely in a state of breakdown and unclarity. So a subculture has difficulty defining itself even more when the culture around it is not defining itself anymore. So we're at such an inflection point on that. But to jump to the business at hand, which is where the ELs go, and with partnership relations, where the sweet spot is, and I know everybody knows this, is when you combine autonomy and synergy. All of us have certainly discovered in Unity Earth and all these other groups that we've worked with in networks, that when you have autonomy and then when you synergize from autonomy, you get really great results, because the individual autonomy and integrity of the individual downloads and gifts of people is recognized, and also then what they can do together on a case-by-case basis is also very easy to spot. So in that sense, where the ELs are at is really, really lucky, because we're a very loose confederation of really gifted people. We're not really stuck on one charismatic leader or on one brand. And that allows us to move forward in a case-by-case basis on what we want to address through autonomy and synergy. So I think, as you may know from the SDG circle, and then I'll keep this short, we actually have one of the subgroups now where there's emerged a group that wants to get into very serious mapping and asset assessment across all of the organizations and gifted people that are a part of our community. And it looks like we're going to be given a website by which we could process that and really take a look at what the potentials then may be in real time for these groups of groups and networks of network going into the future. So that makes it actually, I think, easier for a group like the ELs to define what it may be doing. You know, for instance, if you look at the synergy circles and the video that Diane's putting together from a lot of illustrations that I sent them and put into banners, one of the reasons that our own synergy circles appear to be very successful, and it's a good way to say it, they appear to be very successful, is that they have decided to do certain things by autonomy and synergy in certain situations, and they've done them well. And the number of those that have happened is multiple. But that's much easier than the type of things that John and Roger are talking about, where you have an existing community that's trying to redefine itself over time. that really demands the types of structures that a loose confederation doesn't demand. So those are two very different situations. And I'm not sure myself what the future is of those communities that have to define themselves as subcultures into the future when our global culture is really so unclear. So, you know, that is a very difficult situation to be in. But I think, you know, last sentence is, the situation the ELs are in is a very fortunate one. There's so many things that we can do without having to address these stickier things that get involved with things that are tightly structured and have, you know, lots of financial obligations, lots of personal obligations, a lot of family obligations. So, you know, the landscape now is just really interesting and challenging. And it's going to be learn as you go, because none of us have the answers. So anyway.
Wow, thank you, Kurt.
Linnea.
Well said.
Very well said. I just want to bring in a couple of things because I closely follow both the Whidbey Institute and Hollyhock. And the Whidbey Institute, you know, both of these centers, they're not the kind of living community that Findhorn is, but they have been, you know, in the position of how you translate the kind of work that has been done kind of online and now more hybrid. And the Whidbey Institute has been really working with a holacracy model. I think fairly successfully through this time when they basically had to almost completely close down, let go of staff. And also Hollyhock has been working as a team. So it's been very interesting to watch these centers that are not run hierarchically, but really collaboratively through these periods of, you know, how do we deal with this? And it's been very exciting to watch. And I don't know how well it's been documented as models, but I think both of these centers have been pretty successful in maintaining themselves and at the same time recognizing that the workshop model that all of us sort of grew up in over the last 30 years is probably dying and needs a whole other model of how these beautiful place centers are going to be utilized into the future.
Well, thank you. And we have just 3 minutes left. So I'd like to ask John and Roger to give us some closing remarks.
Yeah, all really good points. And one point that, you know, again, I'll make about the incubator of Findhorn is, you know, we could have spent the whole time and more just discussing the organizational structure of Findhorn. But one key is the Findhorn Foundation is really the educational center, which is what's best known for all of these educational programs that people associate with Findhorn. Now, if the Findhorn Foundation ceased to be, the community wouldn't go away. The community is a much wider entity, the eco-village, that would continue functioning just fine with passion and commitment and different organizations that express themselves in the ways that they, according to what their mission and their work is. So there's often confusion between the Findhorn Foundation and the Findhorn community as a whole. And the Findhorn Foundation is a part of the Findhorn community, but it's the best known part. So when we talk about the community, partnering with the community, et cetera, it's exactly who would we be partnering with? I know I've had some exchanges with David Sloan Wilson, whose work has been very formative for me in certain ways. And he's very interested in getting involved, and we're exploring ways that might happen. So as far as how to pursue this, I don't have answers right now. If it's not an organization to organization type of partnership, it could certainly have to do with individuals who are interested in being involved, finding the appropriate ways to engage. So I'll leave it at that.
I think my takeaway is around this concept that Kurt mentioned in terms of the global culture in the midst of enormous change, and then you have communities of subculture that and how are they going to adapt? And I think that tension is worthy of an exploration. And the other is, I've been associated with some other centers as well around the place, and many of them are asset rich and cash poor, meaning that they have physical infrastructure that they have to care for and maintain, and over time those buildings degrade, and that has happened with Findhorn and other places as well. And where the evolutionary leaders are poised is that you don't have all of these assets, you don't have buildings, so you have mobility and the ability to do things that a fixed community stuck in time in a geographic place is struggling with. So I'm just curious how this dialogue is going to unfold in the years to come.
Yeah, it's how do we land these values into our day-to-day life?
Yeah.
Not discuss them or teach them in a workshop and then go home. That's where Findhorn has the pressure. It's living it day to day, and there's great joy in that. And there's also additional set of challenges.
Yeah. And I would like to just conclude on a very hopeful, positive note. The spirit of Findhorn is strong and robust and can weather all of this. It may not take the form that we like, but it will take a form and it will go forward into the future and be a blessing to the world. So I want to leave on that note. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both so much. What an inspiring, informative, and rich discussion. I think we've all been really privileged to be a part of this today. And I think you have given us a lot of hope for the future. As far as the evolutionary leaders go, we are very rich in assets, and they're not tangible, they're relational.
Yeah.
And it is these relationships with people like Roger and John that make this community so very, very special. So I'd like to conclude by inviting everyone to join us next Tuesday at the same time that this call was, that's 9 Pacific, 12 Eastern, in the same Zoom room, when we're going to have the Source of Synergy Foundation honor Dr. Kurt Johnson with the Synergy Superstar Award. Yay! And as you all know, we are well along in our nominations process. So we'll be watching that to see how that moves into 2022. And I think that's going to be a very exciting year for the evolutionary leaders. And it is certainly my sincere hope that we develop this idea of the partnerships into something to take what we already have with Findhorn through the Findhorn Foundation and John's work and everything we've learned from Roger today as well, and take that into the future with more organizations finding one another and working in alignment to bring forth this new way of living on the earth that we all feel is critical to the future of humanity and all life on the planet. Mm-hmm. So blessings to everyone. Thank you, Diane Williams, for recording this call, and we'll be making it available to all of the evolutionary leaders. So we'll see you next Tuesday. Goodbye, everybody.
Lovely to see old friends.
Yeah.
Great to be here.
Bye-bye.
Lots of love.
Thank you.